You don't get to sit at this table." The words landed in the boardroom like a gavel strike, sharp enough to stop every conversation in its tracks. For a second, even the hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to disappear. 38 stories above Manhattan, inside the headquarters of Whitmore Global Holdings, more than 20 executives turned their attention toward a single moment unfolding at the head of the table. Monica Hayes stood there calmly, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored navy suit, simple pearl earrings, and the kind of quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. Across from her stood Richard Whitmore, the billionaire chairman whose name was engraved on the side of the building itself. Monica extended her hand. Richard looked at it. Then he looked past it. His gaze slid away as if the gesture had never existed. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Around the room, a few board members exchanged glances. One chuckled. Another shook his head. Then the laughter spread, small at first, then louder. Not because the joke was funny, because they believed the same thing Richard did. Monica left her hand suspended for one long second before lowering it. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply took the empty seat nearest the head of the table. Richard immediately stopped smiling. "Actually," he said, adjusting the cuff of his expensive gray jacket, "that seat is reserved for decision-makers." The room laughed again. Monica slowly folded her hands on the polished walnut table. Sunlight reflected across the surface like liquid gold. "Is that right?" she asked. Her voice was calm enough to make the room feel strangely smaller. Richard nodded. "You're welcome to observe. But that chair belongs to people who move markets." Several board members smirked. One woman leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something that triggered another round of laughter. Monica noticed every face, every reaction, every person willing to follow the mood of the room. She remembered them the way investors remember numbers. Carefully, precisely, without emotion. The meeting had not officially started, yet the atmosphere already felt charged, like a storm gathering behind clear skies. Richard walked toward the front display screen while speaking to the board. "Today we'll be discussing the largest expansion initiative in company history, the kind of project that separates leaders from spectators." Another glance toward Monica, another ripple of amusement. "Some people," he continued, "just happen to be in the room when history is made." More laughter followed. Monica remained silent. Through the glass walls, Manhattan stretched for miles beneath the afternoon sun. Yellow taxis looked like tiny moving dots. Ferries crossed the Hudson River in the distance. The city moved forward without caring who felt important inside a conference room. One younger executive, sitting halfway down the table, shifted uncomfortably. Ethan Brooks, the board secretary, had been reviewing attendance records when Monica entered. Something about her name had caught his attention. He looked down at his tablet again. Hayes. The name felt familiar. Very familiar. But before he could think further, another burst of laughter pulled his attention back to the room. Richard had just made a show of introducing every major investor represented at the meeting. Every investor except one. Monica listened without interruption. The omission was deliberate. Everyone knew it. Richard knew it. The board knew it. Yet no one challenged him. Silence became its own kind of agreement. Richard finally turned back toward her. "I hope nobody minds," he said with a grin. "But I prefer to know who's funding my projects before I shake their hand." The room erupted. Louder this time. More confident. More comfortable. Monica looked around the table slowly. Her eyes moved from face to face. Some laughed openly. Some avoided eye contact. Some simply watched. Then she looked directly at Richard Whitmore. For the first time all afternoon, a hint of a smile appeared on her face. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something else. Something that made Ethan Brooks stop typing. Something that made the laughter feel a little less certain. Monica leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. The room thought it had already decided who belonged there. What nobody realized was that the most expensive mistake of their careers had already been made. The laughter slowly faded, but the damage had already been done. It lingered in the room like smoke after a fire, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Monica Hayes remained seated while the board settled back into their chairs. Not one person offered an apology. Not one person questioned what had just happened. The meeting moved forward as if public humiliation were simply another item on the agenda. Richard Whitmore stood near the presentation screen with the confidence of a man who had spent decades believing every room belonged to him. Charts filled the display behind him. Revenue forecasts, expansion targets, acquisition opportunities stretching across North America. He spoke as though success were inevitable, as though money simply appeared wherever he pointed. Monica listened quietly. She had learned long ago that the loudest people in a room were rarely the most powerful. Real power often arrived without an introduction. Across the table, several directors continued exchanging amused looks. One of them, a silver-haired executive named Thomas Green, leaned back in his chair and glanced toward Monica. "I am curious," he said. "Which department are you representing?" A few smiles appeared around the table. Monica looked at him calmly. "I am representing capital." The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it triggered another round of restrained laughter. Richard smiled. "Everyone represents capital in some way." Monica simply nodded. She did not correct him. She did not explain. The board assumed her silence meant uncertainty. In reality, it was patience. Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes toward the tablet resting in front of him. Something continued bothering him. During the introductions, every institutional investor had been mentioned except Hayes Capital. That omission made no sense. He opened a financial summary and began scrolling. Numbers filled the screen. Ownership percentages, strategic partnerships, funding commitments. Then he froze. Hayes Capital was not a minor stakeholder. It was the largest external funding source connected to the entire expansion initiative. Ethan blinked and checked again. The numbers remained exactly the same. $3 billion. His pulse quickened. He glanced toward Monica. She sat quietly near the head of the table, showing none of the frustration another person might have displayed. It was as if she already knew how the story would end. Richard continued presenting projected growth across multiple markets. "Our future depends on bold decisions," he declared. "And fortunately, this board has always recognized talent when it sees it." Several members nodded approvingly. Monica almost smiled at the irony. Outside the windows, clouds drifted across the Manhattan skyline. Sunlight moved across the conference table inch by inch. Time kept advancing. The room did not realize it was moving toward a cliff. Ethan looked down again and opened a deeper investor profile. The name appeared immediately. Monica Hayes, founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Capital. He felt the air leave his lungs. Suddenly, every moment from the past 15 minutes looked different. The ignored handshake, the laughter, the comments about decision-makers. Ethan slowly raised his eyes toward Richard Whitmore. The chairman was still speaking, still performing, still completely unaware of who sat only a few feet away. For the first time since the meeting began, Ethan felt something colder than discomfort. He felt dread, because while everyone else in the room believed Monica Hayes had been invited to observe history, Ethan had just discovered that history might belong to her. Ethan Brooks stared at the screen in front of him and felt the room tilt without moving. $3 billion. The number sat there in black and white, impossible to misread and even harder to ignore. He scrolled through the records again. Hayes Capital, lead funding partner, strategic investor, critical financing source. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Monica Hayes was not an observer. She was one of the most important people in the building. Yet around the conference table, the performance continued. Richard Whitmore walked confidently through another slide filled with projections and applause-worthy forecasts. The board followed his lead the way passengers follow a pilot through turbulence, trusting that somebody else had checked the instruments. Monica remained silent. Her composure seemed almost unnatural now. Ethan watched her carefully. She was not checking her phone. She was not taking notes. She was simply listening, like someone measuring every word against a standard nobody else could see. Richard stopped beside the screen and folded his arms. "The expansion will redefine this company for the next decade," he announced. "And thankfully, decisions of this magnitude are being handled by experienced people." His eyes drifted toward Monica for a fraction of a second. The message was obvious. Several directors smiled. One of them, a venture capitalist named Charles Benton, leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. "I have to ask," he said, "what exactly is your role in all this?" The room grew quiet enough to hear the air conditioning. Monica turned her attention toward him. "I am interested in how the company plans to protect its investors." Charles laughed softly. "That sounds like a consultant answer." A few people joined him. Richard smiled. "Everyone wants to advise. Very few people carry responsibility." Monica nodded once. Responsibility usually follows accountability. The answer was calm, but something about it made the laughter fade more quickly than before. Richard immediately changed the subject. Anyway, let us focus on the people actually driving this initiative. He clicked to the next slide. Monica was excluded again. Deliberately. Publicly. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He considered speaking up. He imagined interrupting the chairman. He imagined explaining exactly who Monica Hayes was. But the room operated on hierarchy, and Richard sat at the top of that hierarchy. Challenging him was not something people did lightly. Across the table, another director shook his head and chuckled. Some people get invited into a room and start thinking they belong there. This time several board members laughed openly. Monica did not. She looked out the window for a moment. Sunlight reflected against neighboring skyscrapers, turning glass towers into mirrors. For a brief second, she seemed far away from the room entirely. Then she looked back toward the table. Her expression had not changed. Ethan suddenly remembered a story he had read years earlier. A famous investor once said that character reveals itself when money enters the conversation. Looking around the room now, he wondered what $3 billion might reveal about everyone sitting there. Richard clicked through another presentation slide and spoke with increasing confidence. The board nodded along. Nobody noticed that Monica had stopped looking at the screen. Nobody noticed that Ethan had stopped taking notes. And nobody noticed the growing certainty forming in the silence. The room believed it was testing Monica Hayes. The truth was far more dangerous. Monica Hayes was testing the room. The meeting continued, but Ethan Brooks could no longer hear it the same way. Every comment now carried a different weight. Every laugh sounded sharper. Every dismissive glance felt more dangerous. He sat quietly near the end of the conference table, watching a room full of accomplished executives walk deeper into a mistake they did not even realize they were making. Richard Whitmore stood beneath the glow of the presentation screen, completely in control of the conversation. Or at least he believed he was. Numbers flashed across the display behind him. Market forecasts. Expansion targets. Investor confidence projections. The board followed along with approving nods. Monica Hayes remained silent. The stillness around her seemed almost deliberate now, like an anchor resting beneath rough water. Ethan opened another file and reviewed the investor agreements one more time. The language was unmistakable. Hayes Capital had leverage written into every major phase of the project. Without that support, timelines would collapse. Financing would stall. Partnerships would unravel. The entire expansion depended on confidence from a source sitting quietly at the same table where people were treating her like an outsider. Ethan finally cleared his throat. The sound was small, but it interrupted the flow of the meeting. Richard glanced toward him. Something to add. Ethan hesitated. For a moment, every eye in the room shifted toward him. I was reviewing investor documentation, he said carefully. There may be a few details worth discussing before final approvals. Richard smiled without warmth. We can handle details later. Right now we are discussing vision. A few board members nodded immediately. The conversation moved on before Ethan could continue. Across the table, Monica watched the exchange without expression. It was not the look of someone surprised by what happened. It was the look of someone who had seen it happen before. One director adjusted his glasses and leaned toward Richard. I think we can all agree that strong leadership is what attracted investors in the first place. More approval followed. Richard accepted the compliment as naturally as breathing. Leadership matters, he replied. Money follows confidence. Monica lowered her eyes briefly toward the table. Ethan noticed the smallest hint of a smile. Not amusement. Recognition. As if she had just heard a familiar line from a script she already knew by heart. The afternoon sun continued shifting across the room. Long shadows stretched across polished wood and expensive leather chairs. Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass walls, indifferent to boardroom politics. Ethan looked at Monica again and found himself wondering how many rooms she had entered like this before. How many times people had mistaken calm for weakness? How many times assumptions had been made before facts were checked? The answer seemed written in her composure. Then another director spoke. With all due respect, he said while glancing toward Monica, major decisions require experience at the highest level. Several people murmured agreement. Richard nodded. Exactly. The room moved forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet Ethan could feel the atmosphere changing. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Confidence was becoming arrogance. Arrogance was becoming blindness. And blindness had a cost. Monica sat perfectly still, listening to every word. The board believed they were evaluating an observer. Ethan knew better now. The real evaluation was happening in silence. And one by one, the people around that table were failing it. The boardroom had become comfortable with its own assumptions. That was the dangerous part. Not the jokes. Not the dismissive comments. Comfort. The kind that convinces people they are right before they have checked the facts. Richard Whitmore stood at the front of the room, speaking with growing confidence, as the presentation moved deeper into projected revenues and expansion schedules. Every forecast on the screen depended on funding that nobody seemed interested in discussing. Monica Hayes sat quietly near the head of the table, her posture unchanged, her attention steady. To the people around her, she appeared detached from the conversation. In reality, she was paying attention to everything. Every interruption, every glance, every person willing to measure value by appearance rather than information. Then Richard stopped beside the screen and looked directly at her. I suppose this level of discussion can feel overwhelming if you are not accustomed to boardroom strategy, he said. Several directors laughed immediately. Others smiled into their coffee cups. Monica met his gaze without blinking. I understand strategy very well, she replied. Richard folded his arms. I am sure you do. The room chuckled again. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of something much larger. Ethan Brooks felt his stomach drop. He knew Richard had crossed another line, and this time the insult was impossible to disguise as humor. Yet nobody challenged it. Nobody corrected it. Nobody asked the obvious question. Why had they spent an entire meeting talking around the person whose firm represented the largest source of capital connected to the project? Monica lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished table. For a moment, the room disappeared. 20 years earlier, she had stood inside another conference room in Chicago. She had been 23 years old, carrying a portfolio filled with financial models she had spent months preparing. Before the meeting even started, someone had mistaken her for administrative staff and asked her to bring coffee. Nobody apologized after learning who she was. They simply acted as if the mistake had never happened. 5 years later, it happened again. Different city, different company, same assumptions, same smiles, same quiet message that she did not belong in spaces where decisions were made. Monica returned to the present. The memories no longer hurt. They informed. They reminded. They taught her to recognize patterns before other people even noticed they existed. Across the room, Richard continued speaking about leadership. The irony hung in the air like a storm cloud nobody wanted to acknowledge. Ethan watched Monica carefully. Instead of reacting, she reached for her phone. The movement was so small that nobody else noticed. She unlocked the screen and typed a short message. No dramatic expression, no visible frustration, just a few words sent into motion. Less than 10 seconds later, the device vibrated once. A response had arrived. Monica glanced at it briefly. Then she placed the phone face down on the table. Her expression never changed. Ethan could not see the message, but something about the exchange made the room feel colder. Outside, the afternoon sunlight continued fading across the skyline. Inside, the meeting pushed forward, unaware that a countdown had quietly begun. Richard believed he was still controlling the conversation. The board believed the day was proceeding exactly as planned. Only Monica knew that the most important decision of the afternoon had already been made, and unlike the people around her, she did not need an audience to exercise power. The message Monica Hayes had sent was only 4 words long. Initiate withdrawal review immediately. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. No threats. No warnings. Real power rarely needed extra words. Hundreds of miles away, inside the headquarters of Hayes Capital, a team of analysts and attorneys had already begun moving. Procedures were being reviewed. Funding commitments were being examined. Risk assessments were being updated. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was happening quietly. Back in Manhattan, nobody in the boardroom knew any of it. Richard Whitmore continued speaking with the confidence of a man who believed the future belonged to him. Within 18 months, he announced, pointing toward a graph climbing steadily upward, this expansion will increase shareholder value beyond every previous projection. Applause followed. Several board members nodded enthusiastically. One executive even tapped the table in approval. Monica listened without interrupting. Ethan Brooks did not. He could barely focus on the presentation anymore. Every chart now looked fragile. Every projection seemed dependent on a foundation nobody had bothered to respect. He checked his tablet again. The numbers had not changed. He quickly silenced the device and returned his attention to the presentation. Barely visible, but different. The atmosphere had begun shifting, like air pressure changing before a storm arrives. Richard clicked to another slide and launched into a discussion about future acquisitions. Our financial position gives us tremendous flexibility, he said proudly. Very few organizations can operate at this level. The chief financial officer suddenly raised a hand. Richard paused. The interruption seemed to annoy him. Something urgent? He asked. Probably nothing, the executive replied, though his voice lacked certainty. I just received a request from one of our funding partners for updated exposure reports. Richard shrugged. Then send them. The board moved on. But Monica knew exactly which reports were being requested. She had approved them herself less than 20 minutes earlier. Outside the windows, clouds were beginning to gather over the Hudson River. The sunlight that had filled the room all afternoon was slowly fading. Shadows stretched across the conference table. The board remained focused on forecasts. Monica remained focused on people. There was a difference. Forecasts predicted what might happen. People revealed what would happen. Another phone vibrated. Then another. This time 2 executives exchanged concerned looks. The interruptions were still small enough to dismiss. Yet they were becoming harder to ignore. Ethan watched the reactions carefully. Questions were forming. Uncertainty was spreading. Nobody understood the cause. Nobody except Monica. She sat calmly in her chair, hands folded, posture unchanged. The board believed the meeting was still under control. Richard believed the company was still moving exactly where he intended. But beneath the surface, invisible currents were already shifting direction. The countdown had started, and for the first time that afternoon, the room was beginning to feel it. The first person to truly understand what was happening was not Richard Whitmore. It was the chief financial officer. He stared at his phone longer than before, reading the same message twice as if repetition might change the words. It did not. His expression tightened. Then another notification arrived. And another. The room continued discussing projections, while a different reality quietly unfolded beneath the surface. Richard clicked to the final phase of the presentation and spread his hands confidently. This company has never been stronger, he declared. The future is already secured. For a moment, nobody challenged him. Then the chief financial officer slowly stood. The movement drew attention immediately. Chairs stopped shifting. Conversations died. Even Richard paused. Is there a problem? He asked. The executive hesitated. I am receiving multiple alerts from our funding partners. Richard frowned. Then handle them after the meeting. The executive did not sit down. I do not think this can wait. A strange silence settled across the boardroom. Monica Hayes remained perfectly still. Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes briefly. He already knew where this was going. Richard looked irritated more than concerned. Fine. What is so urgent? The chief financial officer swallowed. Hayes Capital has initiated a comprehensive funding review. Several board members exchanged confused looks. One director shrugged as if the news meant nothing. Another leaned back comfortably in his chair. Richard gave a dismissive wave. Routine procedure. Monica finally spoke. Sometimes. Her voice was calm enough to cut through the entire room. Every eye turned toward her. Richard folded his arms. And sometimes. Monica looked directly at him. Sometimes it means confidence has changed. Nobody laughed this time. The room had become too quiet. The chief financial officer checked another message. His face lost color. There is more, he said carefully. They have requested immediate reassessment of all active commitments connected to the expansion initiative. A murmur spread around the table. Richard's confidence flickered for the first time all afternoon. Only for a second. Then it returned. I am sure we can resolve any concerns. Monica nodded slightly. I am sure we will discover whether there are concerns. Richard looked at her more closely now. Not as an observer. Not as an outsider. As a variable he no longer understood. You seem unusually informed about this situation, he said. Monica unfolded her hands and stood. The movement felt larger than it should have. The city skyline glowed behind her as the afternoon light faded into early evening. For the first time since entering the room, she occupied the space completely. Nobody interrupted. Nobody smiled. Nobody looked away. Earlier today, she said. "You refuse to shake my hand." The words landed softly, but the impact was immediate. Richard said nothing. Monica continued. "You questioned whether I belonged at this table. You questioned whether I understood strategy. You questioned whether I had earned a seat among decision-makers." The room felt frozen. Ethan watched every face. The same people who had laughed now looked uncertain. Monica's gaze never left Richard. "The hand you refuse to shake belongs to the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Capital." Complete silence followed. No phones. No whispers. No movement. Monica took one step forward. The same hand signed $3 billion into this company. The room stopped breathing. Richard Whitmore stared at her as realization arrived all at once. Around the table, faces shifted from confusion to disbelief. The laughter from earlier suddenly felt very far away. Monica stood calmly in the center of the silence she had just created. And for the first time that afternoon, everyone in the room finally understood who had really been making the decisions. The silence shattered almost immediately. Questions erupted across the boardroom from every direction. Directors who had spent the afternoon laughing now scrambled to understand what had just happened. Several reached for their phones. Others opened laptops. The chief financial officer remained standing, staring at the latest updates appearing on his screen. Richard Whitmore looked as though the room had suddenly become unfamiliar territory. For the first time all day, he was not the person controlling the conversation. "There has to be some misunderstanding," one board member said. Another shook his head and whispered, $3 billion? The number seemed larger now that it had a face attached to it. Monica Hayes remained calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand apologies. She simply watched reality catch up with the assumptions that had filled the room all afternoon. The chief financial officer cleared his throat. "I have confirmation," he said quietly. "The review is active. Several funding channels connected to Hayes Capital have already been flagged for reassessment." The words landed like falling dominoes. One director immediately opened a spreadsheet. Another began calculating timelines under his breath. Expansion schedules that had looked certain an hour earlier suddenly appeared fragile. Richard finally found his voice. "Monica, perhaps we should discuss this privately." She looked at him for a moment. Earlier that afternoon, he had refused to shake her hand in front of the entire board. Now he wanted privacy. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "I believe transparency has worked well for this meeting so far," she replied. Nobody laughed. Across the table, Ethan Brooks watched the transformation unfold. It was remarkable how quickly confidence could disappear when information arrived. The same executives who had dismissed Monica now treated every word she spoke as if it carried weight. The truth was that it always had. They simply had not recognized it. Another phone vibrated. Then another. New messages continued arriving. Legal teams, investment partners, financial analysts. The ripple effects were spreading beyond the room. Richard loosened his tie slightly. His carefully constructed certainty had begun to crack. "Surely this is not about a misunderstanding during introductions," he said. Monica tilted her head slightly. "You still think this is about introductions?" The room became quiet again. Outside the windows, evening shadows stretched across Manhattan. Lights flickered on throughout the city below. Inside the boardroom, another kind of illumination was taking place. People were seeing things clearly for the first time. "This was never about a handshake," Monica continued. "It was about judgment. You decided who belonged in this room before learning who was actually sitting in it." Nobody challenged her. Nobody could. The evidence had played out in front of dozens of witnesses. The chief financial officer checked his phone once more and exhaled slowly. "Without Hayes Capital," he said carefully, "every major timeline attached to the expansion will require reevaluation." The statement hit harder than any accusation. Numbers carried authority that opinions could not. Around the table, faces fell. Plans that had looked unstoppable now looked uncertain. Partnerships that seemed guaranteed now looked vulnerable. Richard stared at the conference table, avoiding the eyes of the people around him. Earlier, they had followed his lead without question. Now they were looking at him differently. Leadership looked less impressive when it arrived attached to avoidable mistakes. Monica stood calmly at the center of the room. She had not humiliated anyone. She had not demanded revenge. She had simply revealed the truth. And as the boardroom absorbed the consequences of its own assumptions, one reality became impossible to ignore. The most expensive mistake of the day had not been financial. It had been personal. No one spoke for several seconds. The boardroom that had been filled with laughter now felt impossibly quiet. The city lights beyond the glass walls reflected across the table like scattered stars, but inside the room, nobody seemed interested in the view anymore. Every attention remained fixed on Monica Hayes. Richard Whitmore sat motionless, staring at the documents in front of him as though they belonged to someone else. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon was gone. In its place sat a realization he could not avoid. The assumptions had been wrong. The judgments had been wrong. And the consequences were already moving. Monica looked around the room one final time. She recognized every expression: regret, embarrassment, disbelief. A few people could not meet her eyes. Others looked as though they wanted to apologize but did not know where to begin. Ethan Brooks watched quietly from his seat. More than anyone else, he understood what had really happened. This had never been a financial story. The money simply exposed the truth. The real issue had appeared the moment Monica walked through the door. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Monica," he said carefully, "I believe mistakes were made today." The sentence sounded small compared to everything that had happened. Monica nodded once. "They were." Richard looked down briefly before continuing. "I would like an opportunity to repair the relationship." Several board members immediately agreed. Heads nodded around the table. The urgency in their reactions was impossible to miss. Earlier, nobody had been interested in hearing Monica speak. Now everyone wanted her approval. Monica listened patiently. Then she looked toward the skyline for a moment. Thousands of lights stretched across Manhattan. Millions of people moving through their lives. Most would never enter a boardroom like this. Most would never control billions of dollars. Yet respect was not supposed to belong only to powerful people. That was the lesson the room had missed. She turned back toward the board. "You are still talking about money," she said quietly. "That is why you are confused." Nobody interrupted. If I had walked into this room with a different name, a different face, or a different background, none of this would have happened. The funding did not create respect. The funding only forced you to reveal where respect was missing. The words settled over the room like truth written in stone. Richard had no response. Neither did anyone else. Because there was nothing left to argue. Monica picked up her portfolio and prepared to leave. The movement seemed to signal the end of something larger than a meeting. Before reaching the door, she paused. Every eye followed her. Then she delivered the final words of the day. "You laughed because you thought power looked a certain way. You thought leadership looked a certain way. You thought influence looked a certain way." She glanced around the room one last time. "The market does not care about your assumptions. Neither do I." Complete silence followed. Monica opened the door and walked out without waiting for a response. The board remained seated long after she was gone. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody celebrated projections or expansion plans. The room had changed too much for that. Ethan looked toward the empty chair Monica had occupied all afternoon and understood something the others were only beginning to learn. Real power does not announce itself. Real power does not demand attention. And real leadership does not need to raise its voice. As the lights of Manhattan glowed against the night sky, one lesson remained behind in that boardroom long after Monica Hayes had left. Respect is not a reward for success. It is the minimum standard that should have existed from the beginning.